And now we're going to start, before good news, we have some news today. We're going to tell you today's stock market report. Helium is up, feathers were down, paper was stationary, fluorescent tubing was dimmed in light trading, knives were up sharply, cows steered into a bull market, pencils lost a few points, hiking equipment was trailing, elevators rose, while escalators continued their slow decline. Weights were up in heavy trading, light switches were off, mining equipment hit rock bottom, diapers remained unchanged, shipping lines stayed at an even keel, the market for raisins dried up, Coca-Cola fizzled, Caterpillar stock inched up a bit, sun peaked at midday, balloon prices were inflated, Scott tissue touched a new bottom, and batteries exploded in an attempt to recharge the market. Just thought we'd share a little stock market report today. In the midst of all that's happening, it's good to try to put a smile on one's face and start with a good joke, and I promise 1 week I'll actually have one. Of course, this is actually one of the traditions of Easter was to tell jokes. And it was basically seen at Easter, it was God's kind of having the last laugh, but not the mocking, cynical laugh of the crowds on Good Friday, but a deep-hearted laugh of joy of that God's life, God's love is truly what we can trust in and surrender to, manifested in the resurrection of Jesus, and which we continue once again to celebrate and to allow that full impact of Easter to take a hold of us, so that we can live the spirit of this new existence as a new creation. And now, the second Sunday of Easter, I've usually called Pick on Thomas Day. We have the same gospel on this day each year, and I think every homily I've ever heard always kind of puts down Thomas, the Apostle Thomas, with that nickname, Doubting Thomas. And the message has always been, don't be like him, don't be like Doubting Thomas. Of course, rather than simply seeing him as Doubting Thomas, I also like to see him as someone who's struggling to come to an authentic faith. That's his real desire. Now, in the gospel, it mentions that, Thomas is Didymus, which means a twin. His name means twin. Now, the Gospels just don't say things for the sake of saying them, so why would they bother mentioning that fact? Who is the twin? It never mentions Thomas as a biological twin. The twin, of course, is us. It's us, the people reading or listening. The message of the Gospel is that we're meant to discover something of Thomas that is in ourselves as well. And what might some of those things be? Well, first of all, I think all the other apostles had this experience of the risen Jesus, and he had not. And they're all saying, hey, Thomas, you should believe like us. We're all believing. Why are you being stubborn? Why are you holding out? Get with the program. Sometimes we might feel like that on Easter as well. Everyone else is saying, hallelujah, and Jesus is risen. We may not be experiencing that. We might not just want to be mouthing the words. We want to become as an authentic experience of the risen Christ, not just because everyone else is saying so. So Thomas is holding out for that, in a sense. And second, I think it's important to look at why Thomas is struggling with believing. Now, his doubting is not like sitting in an armchair, rubbing his chin, I wonder if I should believe or not. I think when you look at what he says, what he needs in order to believe, he says, unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger into the nail marks and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. When you look at that, on one level, it seems kind of morbid. On another, I think it shows how much Thomas himself has been wounded. That experience of what Jesus went through obviously deeply hurt him. Those wounds of Jesus are like seared into his consciousness. He can't let go of it. It's on his mind, it's in his emotions, it's in his heart. And perhaps that's one of the reasons he was not with the other apostles when Jesus appeared to them. He was probably very distraught. course, it's precisely at those times when we feel that way that we should make that effort to gather as church, to gather as community, for that is where Christ will make his presence felt to us. What we have to remember is that Thomas was an enthusiastic follower of Jesus and wanted to stay close to him. Earlier in the gospel, when Jesus said he was going to awaken Lazarus, Thomas was the one that said, "Let us also go that we may die with him," showing his enthusiasm. And then during the Last Supper, Thomas said, "Lord, we don't know where you are going. How can we know the way?" And of course, Jesus would say, "I am the way and the truth and the life," which shows how much he wanted to stay close to his Lord. Now, when we've been hurt or experienced loss or gone through grief, or someone else suffer or die that's close to us, think about what that does to you. You can't stop thinking about it. You just can't pretend it didn't happen. So when the other disciples tells Thomas, "Yeah, we saw Jesus, so everything is good," Thomas just can't pretend everything is fine and dandy, that things are unicorns and butterflies in a sense. Sometimes we might think that's what faith is about, looking the other way, looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, or ignoring suffering. So I think we are twins with Thomas because we've all been there. What our real struggle with is how to keep loving, how to keep hoping, how to keep trusting when we are overwhelmed with feelings of loss and sorrow as he was. How to still have that trust in a loving God. So the evidence that Thomas is looking for and what he needs to see is that the wounds are healed, that they've been taken care of. Thomas is right to be looking for a God who doesn't ignore the wounds, but heals them, that he makes out of them a new beginning, creates new life through them. What he had learned from Jesus, that God who is intimately with us, who redeems and recycles everything. Many times in our lives, we are wounded. And out of our wounds, we often create more wounds. As they say, hurt people hurt people. There's a saying that unless we allow our wounds to be transformed, they will most certainly be transmitted. Now, when Jesus appears, he appears with his wounds. But he doesn't wound. That's the remarkable thing. It's not about payback or vengeance or punishment. That's where we would be, but that's not where God is. And Jesus reveals the heart of God. Jesus has the wounds, the scars, but he breathes forgiveness. He breathes that forgiveness onto them. It's the same word that we read in the book of Genesis, when God took the dirt and breathed into it the spirit of life. And Jesus does the same. His life is coming from that deeper source. And so Thomas is able to receive from that forgiveness, that breath of God's mercy, of that spirit that Jesus breathes onto him. And that's why we call this, Divine Mercy Sunday. Jesus breathes the breath of God's mercy into our hearts, into our lives, restores us, renews us. As he says, "Peace be with you." And that's that good news of a God who is all merciful, all compassionate, and allows us to be a channel of that in our own lives. So Jesus' wounds are not transmitting the pain that they experienced. They have been transformed and changed into life-giving sacred wounds that are now redemptive. What Jesus is transmitting through his wounds is the same loving embrace into which he himself had surrendered his life. The love of God, the love of the Father. Now that low point, that rock bottom place where Thomas and the other disciples had fallen, would provide the space, the openness into which a new beginning would now be made possible. When we were young, we were often in need of affirmation to boost our sense of ourself, our self-esteem, our self-worth. As we get older, sometimes that can get in the way. That real emptying out of their notions of how strong they are, how smart or capable they were. Especially Peter became a block. It's when we let go of ourself and our self-image and that ego self, that new self is able to emerge. It was a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum and fills it. And God loves that vacuum, that empty space in which we make possible his entrance with his mercy. So it is no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. Unless the grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. It becomes new. Now, when Jesus appears, to Thomas. Of course, he penetrates the locked room and the closed room, and he enters in and he shows Thomas his hands and his side. They are healed. The scars remain. In other words, resurrection and healing that God provides doesn't mean restoring us to where we were before. It means we are changed and transformed into something new. By our suffering, we are changed. It is now the resurrected and glorified God, Christ, because Jesus trusted that way, that process, and we follow him insofar as we also follow and trust ourselves on that same journey. In the book of Exodus, there's a story about Moses being placed in the cleft of a rock, and his face would be shielded from seeing God as God passed by. And then finally at the end, it says he was then able to see the backside of God after he had passed by. In other words, we often may not experience God when we're might not seem to be experiencing God when we're going through a dark period or something difficult. It's only afterwards, sometimes in hindsight, that we can see that God was there, in creating something new. This is the cruciform pattern of reality. This is the way that Jesus reveals. Like when Thomas asked Jesus, "How can we know the way?" And Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life." Now Thomas is experiencing what Jesus was referring to. Or when Jesus said, "No sign will be given except the sign of Jonah," being completely swallowed up, where you're completely helpless and powerless, feeling in the dark, when all you can do is trust that you'll be spit up on shore. While when we're in the midst of a cross, we may cry out like Jesus, "My God, why have you abandoned me?" Jesus, like Job from the Old Testament, called out, and Thomas gives voice to that same struggle of faith, where we are not given an answer or an explanation. What we're given in the midst of that is a relationship to trust in, to surrender to. And so when Thomas saw Jesus' hands and feet, he called out with that great proclamation of faith, "My Lord and my God." And when Jesus says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and have still believed," in other words, blessed are those who have not seen the wounds healed yet who still carry and bear those hurts, but still in the midst of that, hold on even stronger to hope and trust and confidence and love that they will be, who still remain connected to the source of all life and goodness, joy and peace. And Mary's a great example of that. She held all these things in her heart. She didn't always understand them. She didn't, the picture of Mary isn't, she's not pointing to her head like, I got this figured out. She points to her heart. She holds all those things in her heart, continuing to trust, to hope, to love, to surrender to God. Let it be done according to you as you say. So in the same way, Thomas not only makes that proclamation of faith, "My Lord and my God," but then he's able to live it. As the tradition says, he went farther than any of the other apostles, traveling as far as India, preaching and proclaiming and living the faith, and finally dying as a martyr. So that's why I like to see Thomas not as a doubter, but someone who allowed his questioning to lead him to a greater and closer and more authentic faith and commitment to following the way of Jesus, with a faith that not only acknowledges the presence of God in the world, but also is still able to see the world and still sees the Good Fridays that are still there, that sees in them also the Easter Sundays that are also built into them. So he's able to see the wounds that still need to be bound up, the hungry that still need to be fed, the thirsty that still need drink, the homeless that need shelter, the naked that need clothes, the sick that need care, the imprisoned that need visitors, and the Christ in each person that needs to be honored, loved, cared for, respected. Like the transformation of winter to spring, of death to resurrection, Good Friday to Easter Sunday, and doubting Thomas to the Thomas great of faith and trust in his Lord. And may that be the great example that Thomas gives to us as we gather and to witness his presence among us, to live out of the sacred wounds of a love and the power and presence of God that can restore and renew all things and truly make a new creation out of us and of the world in which we live.